Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's lovely to see you all here at the Picky this afternoon. My name is Callum Potter. I'm your host for the two talks this afternoon. And our first speaker will be talking about Seaweed, Ruby George from Cardiff University. Just a quick admin update. We're not expecting to have any fire drills today. So that means if you do hear the fire alarm, it's probably for real. I think we had one at the family day last year, which was rather embarrassing, and that everyone had to get out the picky at a point in the day. But I don't think we've got any planned for today. But if you do hear a fire alarm, it's best to exit. So we've got exits left and right, and at the back, and make your way out to the car park, which is the mustering point. And if you've got any mobile phones with you which are switched on, could you either put them into quiet or airplane or whichever mode so that they don't ring out? That would be perfect. We'll be taking questions afterwards with we'll have a roving mic travelling around the audience so please wait for the microphone to arrive before you ask your question, and then everybody can hear it nicely. So moving on to our talk this afternoon, I was thinking about the kelp industries, and the kelp industries in Orkney were a very important part of the Orkney economy back in the 18th century. But with developments in particularly agricultural fertilisers, that industry just died a death at one point. And so now our main interaction with seaweed is just through walking along the beaches and coasts of the islands. But it's interesting to think about how kelp was used all that long time ago. But today, it's interesting to see how it's being affected by climate change. And our speaker today is Ruby George, a marine ecologist and PhD researcher at the University of Swansea. And she's studying the resilience of seaweeds to storms and climate change, and working from Portugal to Orkney. And I suppose Portugal's rather warmer than Orkney is, at least maybe not this summer. In collaboration with European researchers, including Heriot-Watt University, Ruby's interested in how these ecosystems recover from disturbance, aiming to understand and protect the vital role that seaweeds play in supporting coastal life. We'll pass over to Ruby now, who's going to talk about her research interests, and over to Ruby now.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you all for coming to my talk. Today I'm going to be talking about my PhD research involving seaweed and storms. So, as I was introduced, I'm Ruby. I'm a marine ecologist from Swansea University in Wales, and I research rocky shores, particularly focusing on seaweed. And I started studying seaweed at my undergraduate degree in Aberystwyth University, where they made us all press seaweed for one of our modules. And ever since then, I've been really infused by it, and that's why I decided to do my PhD on it at Swansea. And since then, I've been involved in lots of practical research on seaweed, travelling all across Europe, and including visiting Orkney. And this is my 6th time visiting Orkney now, so I'm really excited to be able to share all the research that I've been doing here over the last few years. Before I started, I just wanted to introduce two people that couldn't be here today. The first one is Professor Jo Porter from Heriot-Watt University, and Jo has been working with me on the Orkney sites here. And she is a professor of marine science at Heriot-Watt University and has been invaluable in helping me understand the northern seaweed populations, as well as practical help in all the field work and experience working in the challenging environmental conditions that Orkney can sometimes bring. And on the bottom is John Griffin, who is my supervisor at Swansea University, and he's an associate professor working on coastal ecology, and he leads the coastal ecology research group that I'm part of at Swansea University. And we study everything from seaweed, limpets, and mangrove forests as well. And as part of that, John is also leading a global network of seaweed researchers. So I'm going to be talking about today one of the main projects of my PhD, which is investigating the resilience of seaweed to storm impacts. And as part of that project, we've had lots of help from all students and volunteers. So I also want to thank everyone else who's been involved. And I think it's been about 100 people involved in this project so far. So climate change isn't just warming our planet, it's driving an increase in extreme weather events such as marine heat waves, extreme temperatures, and importantly for us today, more intense storms. And although storms are a natural part of our climate, they're becoming more intense due to climate change. And it's amplifying the impact of them because storms draw their energy from warm, moist environments, and increasing as the oceans get warmer, there's more energy available. And that means the stronger winds for us, heavier rainfall, and bigger waves. And that combined with rising sea levels adds another layer, letting storms reach further inland and causing more damage than they would have before. In the UK, we've just entered a new storm season, and the 2025 to 2026 storm season started in September. The last season wasn't too bad. We had only 6 named storms, although these included some pretty intense ones like Storm Floris, which recently hit Orkney, and that set new records of wind speeds in Scotland. However, the season before, we had 12 named storms, which was a record-breaking year. So the number of storms vary naturally throughout different seasons, but even in a smaller storm year in the future, we may see more impacts due to the increased intensity of climate change. And this photo behind me shows a storm at one of my local study sites in South Wales, which is the Mumbles Lighthouse. And this is where I go to do all my research. So as you can see, it gets pretty treacherous sometimes. And in Mumbles, they're actually now replacing the seawall and investing a lot of money there in replacing the whole thing so that we're protected against these future floods and storms. So it's a very prominent thing on everyone's mind. And especially here in Orkney and coastal and island communities, the sea is central to life. So more intense storms means more coastal erosion and damaging important habitats, historic sites, and as well as flooding and infrastructure damage. So I'm interested particularly on the impact that storms are having on our marine environments, as I'm a marine ecologist, and my focus is on rocky shore ecosystems. So animals and seaweeds living on the rocky shore are already living in an extreme environment. They have to adapt to cope with not only the pressure of waves, but the tide going in and out. So they have to be well adapted to being both underwater and exposed to air. And the key point here, the key point here is that rocky shore animals and seaweeds are highly adapted to a specific set of conditions, which means that any slight change in that environment could have massive impacts to the community. So rocky shores also face a variety of threats from humans, such as overfishing, which can disrupt the food webs, marine urbanization, which is where we're replacing natural habitats with these seawalls, which are, instead of a beautiful, natural and diverse habitat, we're replacing it with a large concrete block, which has no marine life on it at all and doesn't serve as a habitat. And we also have some invasive species, especially in the UK. We have a invasive species of seaweed, which is called Japanese wireweed. And this seaweed, it grows really fast and it's covered in little air bladders, which makes it float to the surface of rock pools, and it just shades out the entire rock pool, which means nothing else can survive. So the rocky shore is already facing several threats, and it means that they could be even more vulnerable to a large disturbance like a storm. And these storms rip up seaweed from the seabed. And not only does it leave like piles of seaweed on the beach, it also leaves bare patches on the rocky shore where the canopy once was. And this seaweed is vital, really, for the whole ecosystem. The large brown seaweeds, like the wraps and the kelps, they provide a valuable habitat for a range of commercially and species of fish and shellfish. And the seaweed forests also act as nursery grounds, sheltering the young animals from predators and wave action to help maintain diversity. The seaweed, especially large kelp forests, can help buffer wave action, reducing coastal erosion. So the large kelps absorb the shock of the waves and can help protect against these impacts of climate change that are actually threatening them. Kelps also can store carbon, so they take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and collect it in their tissues. And when the piece of tissue breaks off and travels out into the ocean, it can sink down onto the seabed and get trapped in the sediment, which takes the carbon out of the atmosphere and helping to mitigate against climate change as well. And humans benefit a lot from seaweed. In Wales, we have lava bread, which is a common food. And also there's lots of nutritional supplements from seaweed, as well as like seaweed infused gins and rums as well. And all of the benefits that I just described are what we call ecosystem services, which is the range of benefits ecosystems provide to people and include provisioning services like food, regulating services like carbon storage, and supporting services like habitat provision. But also what's important is the cultural services that they provide and the source of recreation and inspiration as well. And although seaweed is so important, we don't really understand how the resilience varies across regions and what makes a seaweed forest less resilient to future storms. So when I'm talking about the resilience of a seaweed forest, I'm talking about its ability to both resist and recover from a large disturbance like a storm or heat wave. A seaweed forest with high resilience can withstand these disturbances and recover quickly, maintaining its structure, diversity, and ecosystem functions. In contrast, a seaweed forest with low resilience is much more vulnerable if it's disturbed, and it may not recover as quickly. It can also shift to a completely different state. For example, like a low resilient seaweed forest can shift from this highly diverse seaweed forest to a more bare rock or turf seaweed dominated, which provides less habitat. This is explained by the ball in a trough theory. So in this example, the ball is the current state of the ecosystem, and the two troughs are the different states, either a highly diverse seaweed forest or a more barren landscape of bare rock and just some limpets and turf algae. And in the high resilience, it takes a lot of effort, a large storm, to push it over the tipping point into a different state. Whereas in the low resilience, even like a small storm could tip it over. So with all that in mind, like how climate change is increasing storms, how seaweed forests are vulnerable and why that resilience matters, we wanted to know like what is actually driving resilience in seaweed forests and help potentially identify forests that may need to be conserved. And this brings me to the main experiment I've been working on for my PhD. And this is a collaborative fieldwork experiment involving all the scientists I've named on the screen. And we're working together to understand this seaweed forest resilience across different regions in the Northeast Atlantic. So in our study, we simulated a very large storm impact across 7 regions by physically removing large seaweeds that are prone to being dislodged during storms. The species we targeted is serrated wrack, which is a large brown seaweed commonly found on rocky shores across the Northeast Atlantic. And the seaweed forms dense canopies on the mid and lower shore. In Orkney, the seaweed can reach like 1 metre long, so it's quite pronounced. And it's an important habitat for all sorts of crabs and snails and fish. So we chose to target the species not only because it's common but it's also present throughout the entire range of the study, which I'm going to discuss a bit later. And also the populations of serrated wrack are actually declining in southern regions. So we're seeing this species start to die out in the south because of increasing warm temperatures. So we wanted to understand what makes it more resilient so we can potentially conserve these species that are dying further south. Our main research questions is how does recovery vary across regions and what are the drivers behind seaweed recovery? So you can see this study spans from the southern limit of serrated wrack in Portugal and Galicia in northern Spain across 7 regions, including South Brittany, southwest England near Plymouth, the northeast England near South Wales, forgot my own, the northeast England near Newcastle, Inner Hebrides near Oban, and here in Orkney, which is the most northern region of the site of the experiment. Where possible, we set up the experiment on 4 rocky shores in each of the regions, with 2 moderately exposed shores and 2 sheltered shores. However, in some regions this wasn't possible because it's only exposed shores in Newcastle and there's only sheltered shores in the Inner Hebrides, for example. So we did our best, but the reason we wanted to include these different exposure levels is so that it can be comparable across the regions to understand what the seaweed is actually facing in the different environments here. But also in Orkney, we've got quite a complex system because we've got really exposed shores and then really sheltered shores created by the barriers between the islands. So we also wanted to account for that and look into how that's affecting the resilience here. And a key strength of this study is obviously the collaborative approach. We're working with local collaborators in each of the regions. As I mentioned, Joe Porter is our collaborator here. And this meant that we were able to not only set up the experiment at the same time, logistically, and monitor the experiment at the same time, but also that we could benefit from that local knowledge and really gain from local expertise in each of the regions. So on each of the shorts, we set up the experiment by removing the large canopy seaweed, so the wracks and the kelps, from 1 metre circular plots that look a little bit like hula hoops. So we tagged them with a physical tag, and because we could really struggle to find them under the seaweed, we also used GPS points so we could go back and find them. And we applied 3 different levels of treatments. So the first treatment was a 100% canopy removal. So we removed all of the seaweed, large brown seaweeds in the 1 metre plot and an additional buffer zone. And this was to simulate a very large storm impact, like a severe heat wave that's decimated the shore. The second treatment was a 50% canopy removal treatment, where we removed just half of the canopy individuals to simulate a less severe storm effect. And we also had a control treatment where we didn't remove any of the seaweed. So we replicated this 4 times per site and on the same rocky shore. So replicated it 4 times on the same shore. And as I said before, multiple sites per region. We set up this experiment in spring 2023, and we've been going out every 3 months, so seasonally in spring, autumn, summer and winter, to resurvey the plots using quadrat samples and counting all the animals and all the different seaweed species we are finding in them. So here are some of the results so far. So this shows the recovery of the seaweed canopy 2 years after the imposed disturbance for the 3 different removal treatments. So we have the control seaweed in red and the 50% removal is in green and the 100% removal is in blue. So in each of the, Okay. So as you can see, in most of the regions, the canopy cover in the removal plots indicated by the blue lines has recovered to similar levels to the control already. So they're converging at the end. So going up the graph, we have the amount of seaweed cover, and along the bottom we have time. So the seaweed has recovered in most of the regions. However, what really stands out is in Brittany. You can see that the 100% removal treatment is still not recovered. That's even 2 years after we removed the seaweed. And this is not what we expected. We expected resilience to gradually decline the further south we went. So we expected really the Iberian Peninsula to be the one that was recovering least. So it was really surprising to see Brittany just stand out like this and have absolutely no resilience. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit, but to start with, I wanted to point out something interesting that we are finding particularly in Orkney. So in Orkney, we've seen in these 100% removal treatments that simulated a very large storm, we've seen a shift to a different species. So we started out with this serrated rack, 100% cover of that. And then a year later, when all the seaweed had grown up, we realized that it had shifted to a different species, and it's now bladder rack. So from first glance, you might think they're the same species, but they are very similar. But the main difference is that bladderwrack has these air bladders, and this allows it to float to the surface, which gives it an advantage as it can get most of the light on the surface of the water, and therefore it will grow faster. Bladderwrack also reproduces slightly earlier in the year compared to serrated rack. And this is interesting because bladderwrack probably just had that advantage to be able to get into these plots first and dominate them. Bladderwrack is also usually found higher up the shore, so it's interesting that it has moved down into the mid-shore, which is usually dominated by serratus. But although this bladderwrack has taken over another species, here in Orkney that's actually turned out to be a positive thing in terms of this experiment. So because we had such a quick establishment of this bladderwrack, it grew into these plots and quickly established a cover, which meant that we didn't see much of an impact of the storm event on the understory species, so all the species that live underneath the canopy. And yeah, they were protected still, even though it was a different species, from this benefit of the cover. And this just demonstrates that having a highly diverse seaweed forest, like in Orkney, enables other species to come in and compensate for what a loss of another one, which is really important. And I think this is what is missing in some of the other regions. And it's identifying how when we're conserving a species, we really want to conserve the whole habitat and not just one of them. So we're now looking into how long this change in species persists. So we're seeing in Orkney that the more wave-exposed sites, the bladderwrack is actually being dislodged very quickly because of these air bladders, which are advantageous to gain more light, actually make them more exposed to wave action. So it's also a negative impact. So we don't expect the bladderwrack to stay around for very long. So we're going to track this and see if potentially the bladderwrack stays long enough to give the serrated rack a chance to recover naturally. So to sum up, the seaweed canopy in Orkney is really resilient to storm damage, as you might expect to be living here. However, it's not in the way that we did expect, and it actually relies on other species to compensate for the loss of it. So contrastingly, these are the plots in Brittany. So on the left, we have the control plot, and on the right, the plot that we removed the canopy from. But this was taken 18 months after the disturbance. So it's pretty impressive that none of the seaweed is growing back at all. And yeah, as predicted, this loss of the canopy habitat has led to reduced diversity of the other species in the area. We've seen less mobile animals. They've potentially just left a nearby canopy, but in a real life situation, they wouldn't have any habitat left on the shore at all. So we're now trying to understand, why is the seaweed so vulnerable in Brittany, and what is driving this lack of resilience? So one of the most important and obvious things we wanted to look at was temperature. So we did this by deploying temperature loggers on each of the shores, and these loggers have been a bit of a pain because they flood constantly, but they've actually given us some quite valuable data. And we're starting to see a pattern where actually in Brittany they are experiencing hotter temperatures when the tide is exposed. So the exposed temperatures are in the orange on the graph. And this is because the spring low tide in Brittany is actually in the middle of the day, whereas the spring low tide in the Iberian Peninsula is in the later morning. So actually when the tide is out, the seaweed in Brittany is facing greater stress than any of the other regions. And it's just demonstrated in the photos. You can see these photos were taken on the same tide and we were doing the same field work, but in Brittany, we were doing it in the middle of the day, whereas in Orkney, it was at sunset. And yeah, you can see Orkney right at the bottom, this side of the graph. And yes, there's no thermal stress really experienced by the seaweed here as expected. So one of the other major factors in the recovery of seaweed is limpets. And this is the most abundant limpet at all of my sites, which is called the common limpet. And yeah, a lot of people think that limpets stay in one place, or the fact that they can't even move or attach to the rock, but that's not actually true. And limpets are really efficient grazers. They tend to graze at high tide. So when the tide comes in, the limpets will move off their space in the rock, which is called a home scar, and they will go out to graze on the seaweed. They graze with teeth called a radula, and this is actually the strongest biological material known to man. And limpets like to graze on young seaweed, so seaweed that is just recruited, because it hasn't had time to invest any energy in defensive materials or strong structure. So it's really palatable and easy for the limpets to graze. But how much limpets do graze depends on two main factors: their size and actually the temperature that they're under. So obviously larger limpets graze more, but also in warmer conditions, the metabolic rate of a limpet will increase, meaning it needs more energy and it's hungrier. So larger limpets in warmer conditions will graze a lot more. So in Orkney, we do actually have a lot of limpets here, but a lot of them are quite small, which means they won't have much of an impact. And obviously in the colder temperatures, it means they aren't as hungry. But in Brittany, we have a lot larger limpets, and they're under these warmer temperatures that I just described, which is why they might be having a greater impact. So to test this, we've actually set up a new mini experiment where we've replicated this whole design, but also removed the limpets in Brittany to see whether the seaweed will grow. Finally, the characteristics of the actual seaweed can influence how resilient it is. And the characteristics of the same species of seaweed, so serrated wrack, can differ between regions as they adapt to their local environment. So as I said, the serrated wrack here in Orkney is over 1 meter long, whereas the same species in Portugal is like 25 centimeters. So it's a big difference for the exact same species. And serrated wrack here in Orkney invests a lot of time in its structural and defensive properties. So they have larger holdfast, which is a structure that attaches the bottom of the seaweed to the rock. And they have thicker stipes as well, which are more bendy to resist wave action. So this graph is showing one of the properties that we measured, which is the surface area per gram. And we're finding that the seaweed in the southern regions has a higher surface area per gram. And this means that it's investing more in capturing light, which means it's got acquisitive growth strategy, it's growing faster. Whereas the seaweed in the northern regions, it's got a lower surface area per gram, which means it's investing less in capturing light and growing, but more in these heavier defensive structures. We also found one interesting thing when taking these trait measurements, which is that the seaweed fronds in Brittany are surprisingly thin, which this is interesting because it might mean that it's more susceptible to grazing by these limpets. So to conclude, the Orkney seaweed forests have proved to be resilient to disturbance due to this alternative species that grows quickly and buffers the impact of canopy removal, highlighting the importance of just not just conserving the one species, but the whole community to keep these healthy and resilient seaweed forests. We also found that the seaweed forests in South Brittany are not resilient at all to these large disturbances, and this may be due to the timing of the low tide, the high abundance of large and hungry limpets, as well as the properties of the seaweed making it more susceptible. We hope that this work can detect early warning signs of when a seaweed forest is likely to collapse, and it can also offer some potential solutions, such as reducing the number of limpets on a shore after the disturbance event to help the recovery of seaweed, but also potentially for restoration projects, because there is a potential to transplant these highly resilient individuals of seaweed in Orkney into the southern regions to try and increase resilience. So I just want to thank all the collaborators that have been working on this project, our funders, and thank you all for listening.
Well, thanks very much, Ruby, for that interesting talk about research into seaweed beds, and I think we'd really all appreciated what you've been looking into. I'm sure we'll have lots of questions. So Rob is our roving microphone man.
Thank you. That was really interesting. It might be a bit grisly, but how do you actually go about getting rid of limpets?
Yeah, so we use a paint scraper. And we were actually having a discussion earlier about how limpets, you have to sneak up on them. So if a limpet hears you coming, or if you tap on its shell, it will clamp down onto the rock really tightly. But if it's still slightly active after the fire's just gone out, it will be loosely attached to the rock, and you can just go underneath it with a paint scraper and pop it off quite easily. So the limpets we only eradicated in this other mini experiment in Brittany, and we did 1.5 meters, but we have to check up on it very regularly to make sure the limpets aren't returning. Yeah.
So, yeah, I wondered when you say a meter square that you're clearing it, if the leaves or whatever the length of the thing is a meter long anyway, it seems to me that in Orkney, that if the tide's flowing in one direction, the square can be covered by stuff from outside. It seems as though a meter square is very small. Would there be a difference if you'd taken 10 square meters? Or 10 meters by 10 meters, I should say, 100 square meters. Would that have made a difference, do you think?
Yeah, so when I'm talking about the meter, I didn't want to bombard you all with too much of the methodology, but the meter is the core plot of what we're actually monitoring. But we actually applied the treatment to a buffer zone as well of 1.5 meters. So we accounted for the fact that the Orkney seaweeds were larger by increasing the buffer zone in Orkney. So we did 1.5 meters here, and we did only 50 centimeter buffer zone in the southern regions in Portugal. So this meant that, yeah, the seaweed doesn't overlap on the plot, and we gave it a little trim if it was overlapping as well to account for that. But to answer the second part of your question, I do think it will have an impact if you clear a much larger plot, definitely. I think one of the major reasons for such a fast recovery in some of the regions is just how abundant the seaweed is there, and how many spores would have been able to settle. So if you removed, if there was a really intense storm that did wipe out an entire shore, we might not see quite the same level of recovery. However, the storms normally affect just like one little patch, maybe the most exposed patch, which is what we try to simulate.
Yeah, quick question. You mentioned basically, I think photosynthesizing, but growing mass through different areas is at different rates. Did you make allowance for the fact that although Orkney's further north, so sun's like 10 degrees lower than in Brittany, for example, in the summer, we do get much longer periods of daylight. Did you actually normalize for how much actual solar energy is coming in each region?
Yeah, I think that's the really interesting part about Orkney. So what I was measuring was the actual properties of the seaweed that are here. So that would account for like the differences between the regions. But that is an interesting question because one of like the sub experiments that we're doing is mesocosms. So we've set up a tank and putting actual seaweed samples in them and recording the actual photosynthetic rate to see if it matches up with what we predict based on the characteristics of the seaweed. And in that, we are having to account for longer daylights here and shorter daylights elsewhere, which is, it gets really complicated when you start designing. Yeah.
Hello, yeah. Did you have a look at the different substrates that the holdfasts actually anchor to? And does that make any difference to its ability to withstand storm damage?
Yeah, I haven't looked at it as part of the study, but when we're in the field doing this research, we definitely noticed a difference between them. Even two sites within South Wales, one of them, like the rock is really hard. And so it meant that holdfast could attach a lot more strongly. Whereas one of them, like you pull a seaweed by accident and the rock actually breaks. It's not the seaweed that's breaking. So I do think that has a major impact on the resistance of the seaweed to storm impacts. And it could be an important point, yes.
Thanks very much for your talk.
Thank you.
A lot of concern about the coast is the extent to which these natural methods can help to increase resilience against storm conditions that you're talking about. Has your various teams come up with ways of, if you like, seeding to grow more? There's lots of talk in estuaries about eelgrass, for instance, but you're talking about much more open coasts.
Yeah.
There's lots of interest in the kelp forests, which are further out. And the further out you go, the hope normally is, from a coastal engineering point of view, that will reduce the wave energy at the vulnerable coastal point. So could you comment on what you see as the way forward there?
Yeah, so I don't think seaweed is like the magical answer to all of our problems, but I do think it can help, especially in the shallower coastal areas. But the team in Newcastle that's part of this project are working on green graveling, which is where they seed loads of little rocks with kelps, and then they just throw the rocks out into the sea, and this establishes new kelp forests in theory. But it's at very early stages compared to restoration of seagrass meadows. I do think it does have potential, and I think there's a kelp forest restoration project in the south of England as well that's working on that. So yeah, I do think in the future it could definitely help with both reducing the storm impacts, but also providing habitat at the same time, which is really important rather than just building another concrete structure to do the same thing.
Thank you for the nice talk. We live just above Warburg in Stromness. The last bit of notes that you made is you thinking of transferring some of the Orkney seaweed to Brittany. in terms of mixing species, what effect do you think would have?
Yeah, so the seaweed is the same species, however, it is genetically different. So there might be some impact with that. Although those genetics might actually help it be more resilient. So it might be a good thing to introduce those genetics to the population there in terms of withstanding the storms. But that's a very future idea that hasn't been looked into properly yet. But it's just an implication of what's come out of this project and yeah, possible solutions in the future.
Yeah. One of the things about dioxide which gets emitted into our atmosphere is a lot of it disappears back into the sea and causes acidification. And you keep reading about how that is affecting and bleaching corals in warm seas off Australia, on the Great Barrier Reef and so on. Strikes me that the place where you had the worst recovery rates were where it was warmer. And have you looked at the impact of dissolved carbon dioxide in the water as potentially affecting the rate of recovery?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And seaweeds can definitely be affected by ocean acidification and just the water in general. But it's an interesting point. I haven't actually looked into it as part of the study, but in the future, that would be good.
Excuse me. I noticed that the Brittany figures did a 50 removal rate on it, and so I wondered if there was any clue that we were missing there. Because the second thing was I'm interested in how the 50% was done. Do you just pick every other of one particular type of animal, or do you clear half of the square or whatever? Or could you just talk about that for a second?
Yeah, of course. So in Brittany, unfortunately, we did decide not to do the 50% removal. We regret that now when we realise how interesting the results are there. But the reason that we chose not to do it was because the clinical team I was working with were worried about the impact that the experiment would have on their seaweed forest. So we just wanted to reduce the impact of the experiment, which is, on the other hand, is also probably a good thing we did that and didn't affect more of the seaweed. Now it's not recovered. But in terms of how we set up the 50% removal treatment, we counted the number of seaweed individuals in the plot and we removed half of them, spread out evenly across the buffer zone and the plot.
Yeah, hi. I'm just thinking about other things that potentially might have affected the results. Did you do measurements of levels of pollution, silt, and other things in the water at each site?
Yeah, so I'm actually, in my spare time, other than the PhD, I'm a representative for Surfers Against Sewage. So I'm very interested in the impacts, particularly sewage and agricultural pollution is having on these sites. Unfortunately, I didn't have the funding to measure it directly as part of this project, but I've been monitoring the amount of sewage discharges in the different areas and I'm hoping to look at that. The one thing that I've been finding is there's just sewage everywhere and there's agricultural pollution everywhere. So all of our sites pretty much are facing it in one way or another. And so I'm not sure how much it's affecting the differences between the regions.
You touched very briefly there on budgets. Could you give us an indication of what, A, is this continuing? B, if it isn't continuing, what sort of money you're short of? And thirdly, if you were going to continue it, what you would need to do, what's in your head for the next stage? So just give us a feel for the shortcomings or the lobbying points we need to be aware of if we're talking to anybody.
Yes, so the initial project was part of a big project called the BEF scale experiment, and BEF stands for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Functioning. So the funding was tied to that, a 3-year project, which is why it's coming to the end of it now. But the main part of the money was spent in the initial setup. And because we work with local collaborators, there's not much money on travel expenses or anything like that. So it's a relatively cheap project now to continue into the future. It's just if we wanted to do additional add-ons like monitoring the sewage pollution or doing genetic studies, which would be really valuable to the experiment, but they're the expensive things to add on, really. The ideal would be to now, and we're discussing the feasibility with everyone, is to just monitor them yearly. So go back every spring, which is the time of year that we set up the study, and monitor them yearly for the next maybe 10 years, and just keep track of them and see how long this lupus fasciculosis, the bladder rack, is persisting. And yeah, that's the main long-term goal for the study. Yeah, I need funding to like finish my PhD, and then after that, the funding is a problem for getting funding in doing any sort of ecological and climate change research. It's been quite difficult to get it, but there's more funding in understanding what uses the seaweed is giving to people for like kelp farms and things like that. I'm not sure. I'm not sure. Like, not much at all. Maybe like a few thousand for the bare minimum. Maybe a couple of tens of thousands for the processing of samples, like the sewage and the genetics.
Couple of quick questions. At the beginning, you mentioned about the Japanese invasive seaweed. Just interested where that is and how quickly it's spreading. And also, from the sort of seaweed ecology point of view, would the bladder rack be like a pioneer species, so the equivalent of a weed coming into an open patch of ground? And do you expect it to sort of mature and become a sort of like a whatever the equivalent of a tree would be, replacing the weeds?
Yes, so for the first question, the Japanese wireweed, I'm not actually sure about its presence in Orkney, but it's definitely in South Wales and it's quite a big issue there, and a lot of the other southern regions as well. And it spreads really quickly. It's covered in these reproductive tips all along the outside of it. So even if you try and remove it, that'll like dislodge all of the reproductive spores and it just spreads even more. So when you're trying to help, it feels like you're actually making it worse as well, unfortunately. But in terms of the bladder rack, yes, it is a pioneer species. But normally it would just be outcompeted by now by the serrated rack. So that's why we're looking to make sure, is this a long-term change or is this actually just a pioneer species and then eventually it'll shift back to its original system?
Well, if we've not got any more questions for now, I'm sure if you've got any other questions or points you'd like to ask Ruby, she'll be able to take some questions in the coffee room upstairs during the break before the next talk. So I'd just like to thank Ruby very much for her presentation and talk, and it's good to have an interesting discussion afterwards as well. This is obviously a topic which is important to a lot of Orkney residents and certainly for other people that have been coming to visit us here this week. So thanks very much again, Ruby.
Thank you.